All right, so today we're diving into something that I think you're going to find really interesting, especially, based on what I see here about your interest in geopolitics and global supply chains.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, this is right up your alley.
Yeah.
Because we're looking at this new ban that China just put in place that goes into effect December 2024 on exporting gallium and germanium to the U.S.
Right.
Now, you might be thinking...
Gallium, germanium, what are those?
Exactly. Like, what are those? Are those just some obscure metals that nobody's ever heard of?
Right.
Well, it turns out they're actually super important for making semiconductors.
They are absolutely critical minerals for a whole range of technologies.
Right. So this is like everything, our smartphones, fighter jets, like all this stuff is impacted by these two metals.
Absolutely. Everything that we think of as modern technology relies on these.
So this ban has huge implications.
It really does. And it's a pretty clear power play by China. I mean, they control something like 80% of the global production of these minerals.
80%. That's wild.
It's huge. Yeah. So, this isn't just about economics. It's about leverage. It's about control in the tech world.
Yeah. So you're saying this is kind of like a strategic move by China. It's not just like, oh, we're going to make a little extra money.
It's much bigger than that. It's about who have the power. And frankly, I think there's a bit of payback involved, too.
Payback? What do you mean payback?
Well, the U.S. has been putting all those restrictions on their own tech exports to China.
Right. Trying to, prevent the sharing of technology that could have military application.
Exactly. And of course, they see that as essential for national security.
Sure.
But from China's perspective, it's seen as a way to kind of stifle their rise as a tech superpower, to maintain American dominance.
Uh-huh.
So this ban is kind of their way of saying, hey, two can play at this game.
So essentially what you're saying is China is kind of holding these critical minerals hostage in a way?
In a sense, yeah. They're showing the world just how much power they wield.
And that's got to have some pretty serious consequences, right?
Absolutely. For one thing, it could seriously disrupt semiconductor production. Imagine waiting months for the latest smartphone release.
Oh, the horror.
Right. Or even worse, think about the potential delays in crucial military equipment, all because they can't get enough gallium.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's a whole different level of problem.
And then there's the economic impact. The cost of electronics could skyrocket.
Yeah.
And, innovation, that could slow down to a crawl.
Yeah, it's like a chain reaction.
Yeah.
One thing leads to another, and pretty soon the whole system's feeling the effects.
Exactly. It's a ripple effect that touches everything.
So I'm guessing the U.S. is not just sitting back and taking this, right? What are they doing to try and counter this move by China?
Well, they're scrambling, that's for sure. They're looking to diversify their supply chains, which means finding alternative sources for these minerals outside of China.
Makes sense. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. And there's a lot of talk about boosting domestic production in the U.S., but that's not a quick fix. It takes time, and frankly, it comes with its own set of environmental challenges.
Yeah, we don't want to just shift the problem from one place to another, right?
Right, and get this. Vice President Harris actually proposed stockpiling gallium and germanium. Like, we're preparing for some kind of resource war.
Stockpiling? Seriously? Like hoarding these minerals like they're the last roll of toilet paper during a pandemic or something?
It sounds a bit extreme, but that's how seriously they're taking this threat. But you're right, it's only a temporary fix.
Yeah, you can only hoard so much for so long before you need to find a more sustainable solution.
Exactly. The real challenge here is for the U.S. and really any country that relies on these minerals to break free from this dependence on China in the long run. This is a wake-up call.
A big one. So we've got this kind of tense standoff brewing between the U.S. and China. But is it possible that this ban could actually backfire on China?
That's a good question.
Like, what if everyone starts scrambling to find alternatives and eventually China loses its grip on the market?
It's definitely a possibility. The market reacted immediately when the ban was announced. Companies like Australia's Lanus Rare Earths and U.S.-based MP materials, their stock prices jumped way up. Investors are betting on them, and others to step up and fill the void.
So it's almost like this high-stakes poker game. Everybody's trying to anticipate the other player's moves, and nobody's quite sure who's going to come out on top.
It's a really complex situation, that's for sure. But I think it's a little premature to declare the end of China's dominance in this market. You have to remember, they didn't get here overnight. They've been playing the long game for decades. building up their infrastructure, refining their processes. They've been very strategic about this.
So you're saying it's going to take a lot more than just a few companies ramping up production to really challenge their position?
Absolutely. It's going to require a massive global effort to create viable alternatives, building mines, refining processes, securing supply chains. This is a long-term game, and it involves a lot of risk and investment.
Yeah, it's not like flipping a switch. This is going to be a slow and probably messy transition.
Exactly. And don't forget, China's watching all of this unfold, and they're probably already factoring it into their strategy. You might be thinking, let everyone scramble for a bit.
Yeah, let them realize just how reliant they are on us.
Exactly. And that could give them even more leverage in the future.
It's like they're playing chess, and we're all just trying to keep up. So what's the real end game here for China? Is this just a temporary tactic to gain negotiating power? Or are they really willing to risk losing their dominance in the long run?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a gamble, no doubt. But China has a history of playing the long game, so it's hard to say what their ultimate goal is. This whole situation just highlights how interconnected the world really is and how vulnerable we all are to disruptions in these global supply chains.
So it's not just a U.S. China problem, is it? Why should the rest of the world care about this whole rare earth mineral standoff?
It's a global issue because remember, Europe is also heavily reliant on these minerals for their industries. If those supplies dry up, it could create a lot of problems for them too.
It's like a domino effect. One thing knocks into another, and pretty soon the whole world is feeling the tremors.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And, there's another aspect to this whole story that we haven't even touched on yet, the environmental angle.
Right. Mining those minerals can't be good for the planet, no matter where it's happening. What are some of the environmental concerns?
I think to really understand the weight of all this, it helps to kind of look back and see how we even got here. The story of these rare earth elements.
Right. It's like, what led to this point where China has this much control over something so vital?
Yeah, exactly. And it's really tied to their whole economic rise over the past few decades. It's not like they just woke up one morning and said, hey, let's corner the market on rare earths. It was a process.
Yeah, like how did they become the big player in this industry? What were the steps along the way?
Well, there's a few things that kind of came together. First of all, they do have a lot of these minerals. Significant deposits.
Okay, so they started with that natural advantage.
Right, but that's just the starting point. I mean, lots of countries have resources, but they don't all become dominant suppliers.
So what did China do differently?
Well, they were smart. They invested heavily in all the infrastructure you need for extraction and processing. And honestly, they often prioritize quick development over, strict environmental regulations.
So they were playing the long game, kind of, knowing that the demand for these minerals was only going to go up as technology advanced.
Exactly. And while other countries, maybe they were focused more on the shiny end products, China was quietly securing control of the essential building blocks.
It makes you wonder, right? Like all those cheap electronics we were buying, were we kind of turning a blind eye to the cost?
Yeah, it definitely brings up those questions about, the hidden costs of our tech obsession. We want the latest gadget, but how often do we think about where the materials come from or the impact of actually getting them out of the ground?
Right. It all comes back to those ethical and environmental concerns we talked about. And now as the U.S. and other countries too are trying to break free from this dependence on China, they got to be careful not to just repeat the same mistakes.
You hit the nail on the head. It's not enough to just shift the problem from one place to another. We need actual solutions, not just a change of scenery.
Right. Sustainable solutions,
Yeah.
not just sweeping the dirt under a different rug.
Exactly. And that's the challenge. How do we get these resources without exploiting workers, without trashing the environment?
Big questions.
Yeah. But this could be an opportunity, to rethink how we do things, invest in new tech, maybe even change how much we consume in the first place.
Okay, so let's imagine for a second that the U.S. and everyone else manages to diversify. They find other sources for these minerals. What happens then? Is this like the beginning of the end for globalization?
It's definitely a turning point. This whole situation, it's really shown how vulnerable we are with this super connected global economy. All our eggs in one basket.
Right, but what does that actually look like?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but one possibility is that we start to see more regionalized supply chains. Countries might start prioritizing security, being able to rely on themselves or their allies, over just going for the cheapest option.
So instead of one big global village, we might end up with several smaller ones, each with its own kind of alliances, maybe even its own technology.
Yeah, that's one way it could go. Whether that happens or not, I think this whole thing with China is going to have a lasting impact on global trade. The idea that the market will just magically solve everything, that's kind of losing its appeal in the face of, these geopolitical realities.
Right. It's like we're realizing that economics and politics are totally intertwined.
Exactly. They always have been, but maybe now it's more obvious.
What about innovation? Like, if the flow of these minerals gets disrupted, even for a little while, won't that stifle all the cool tech advancements that are happening?
It's a real concern. These minerals aren't just for smartphones. They're essential for all that cutting-edge stuff. Renewable energy, artificial intelligence, all of it.
So this isn't just about, like, waiting a few extra months for the new iPhone. It's about potentially slowing down progress in the stuff that could actually help us deal with, climate change and all the big challenges facing the world.
Exactly. That's the bigger picture here. It's not just about gadgets, it's about the future.
So this whole China situation, it's like this crossroads almost.
Yeah, I see.
And the path we choose is going to determine what that future looks like.
Right. Do we retreat into our corners, each country hoarding its own resources and technology? Or do we find ways to work together to develop new sources, new technologies?
Cooperation versus competition.
Exactly. And the decisions being made right now in boardrooms and government offices all over the world, those are the decisions that are going to determine which path we end up on. It's a huge moment. And not just for the tech industry, but for the future of, global cooperation as a whole.
Okay, so we've covered a lot, from geopolitics to economics to tech to the environment. But let's bring it back to our listener for a minute. Someone might be listening to all this and thinking, okay, interesting stuff, but why should I care about this?
That's fair. It can seem really distant, this whole trade dispute over a couple of metals most people have never even heard of.
Yeah.
But it's a perfect example of how something that seems, far away can have a very real impact on our lives. This stuff is in our pockets, in our homes. It's the world we live in. And this situation just highlights how interconnected everything is and how the choices made by governments and corporations have ripple effects that reach all of us.
Right. We're not just passive observers in this.
Exactly. We're all part of this system. And this story is still being written.
Yeah.
The outcome of this standoff, it's uncertain. And the decisions made in the coming months and years, those are the decisions that are going to shape the tech landscape for decades to come.
It's almost like a choose-your-own-adventure book, but the choices are being made by other people. And we all have to live with the consequences.
Right. And this whole deep dive has been about trying to understand those choices, the complexities of these global supply chains, the power dynamics between nations, the ethical dilemmas we face as we try to create new technologies. It's a lot to unpack, but it's crucial information for anyone who wants to understand the world we're living in and the world we're heading toward.
Absolutely. We've covered a ton of ground, but there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to explore. The environmental and social impact of actually mining these rare earth minerals.
Right, because even if we find new sources, the way we get those minerals matters.
Exactly, and that's what we'll be diving into in the final part of this deep dive. So stick with us, there's more to uncover. Okay, so we've talked about all the geopolitical stuff, the economics, the technology, the whole chess game between the U.S. and China. But there's this whole other side to this rare earth mineral story that we really can't ignore.
Right, the human side of it all.
Exactly, the environmental and social costs. Because mining these materials, whether it's happening in China, the U.S., or anywhere else, it's not a clean process. It has a real impact on the planet and the people who live near those mines.
Yeah, and I think it's something that often gets lost in all the talk about securing these resources. Everyone's so focused on winning that they forget about the real-world consequences.
It's like we're so busy moving the pieces on the chessboard that we forget there are actual people standing on those squares.
That's a good analogy.
So let's get specific. What are some of the biggest environmental concerns when it comes to rare earth mining?
Well, one of the most immediate impacts is habitat destruction. I mean, these mining operations can be huge. They clear vast areas of land, displacing wildlife, disrupting ecosystems.
Right, and that can have cascading effects, right? Like one species disappears and it impacts the whole food chain.
Exactly. And then there's the pollution aspect. Extracting and refining these minerals, it releases all sorts of nasty stuff into the air and water. Toxic chemicals, heavy metals, you name it.
And that doesn't just stay in one place, right? It can spread through the air and water, impacting communities far beyond the immediate mining site.
Yeah, it's not just a local problem. It's a regional, sometimes even a global problem.
It's so easy to get excited about all the cool new technologies that these minerals make possible, but we have to remember that it all comes at a cost.
We can't just ignore those costs.
And it's often the most vulnerable communities that end up paying the highest price.
Absolutely. The people who live near these mines, they're the ones who are most directly exposed to the pollution, the health risks, the economic displacement. We can't forget about them.
So what can we do? I mean, it sounds like we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. We need these minerals for all this technology, but getting them comes with all these downsides.
It's a tough situation for sure, but I think it's an opportunity to be smarter about how we approach resource extraction, to invest in research and development, find more sustainable ways to do things.
So what, like finding alternative materials?
Yeah, that's one option. Or developing better recycling technology so we can reuse what we've already mined instead of constantly needing more.
Right, closing the loop, so to speak.
Exactly. And maybe even looking at ways to reduce our overall consumption. Do we really need to upgrade our phones every year? Do we need all these gadgets in the first place?
That's a tough one. We're so used to this culture of more, more, more.
Yeah, but maybe it's time to rethink that. It's not just about technology, it's about our values.
Yeah.
What do we prioritize? What kind of world do we want to live in?
And this is where I think our listeners come in, right? It's not just about governments and corporations making the right decisions. It's about individuals making conscious choices.
Totally agree. Every purchase we make, it's a vote. We can choose to support companies that are trying to do things the right way, companies that are committed to ethical sourcing, responsible manufacturing, things like that.
We can also vote with our wallets by choosing products that are built to last, things that are durable, repairable, so we don't have to constantly buy new stuff and contribute to the demand for more mining.
It's about being mindful of our impact, recognizing that we're all connected and our choices have consequences that ripple outwards.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's leave our listeners with something to think about. This whole situation with China, it's a wake-up call. It's showing us just how fragile our globalized world really is. And it's urging us to rethink our relationship with these critical resources.
It's a reminder that sustainability isn't just a buzzword. It's essential for our future.
It's also a reminder that we're not powerless in all of this. We can make choices that make a difference, both individually and collectively.
And we need to find ways to work together, even when it's difficult. Because these challenges, they're not going away.
We've got to be willing to have these tough conversations, to challenge the status quo, to create a future where innovation and sustainability aren't at odds with each other.
Well said.
So thanks for joining us on this journey into the complex world of rare earth minerals. We hope you found it informative and that you'll continue to explore these issues long after this episode is over. Because knowledge is power, especially in a world that's constantly changing.